Hi, this is a tutorial on how to use the painting tool that comes with the premium version of the Feathers and Fur shader. In order to open the tool, select your avatar's model and the button to open it will be right here inside the material inspector. When you first open the tool, you'll see that there are options to copy any values that are already in the current textures you're using to be the initial values of your new painting project, as well as to match the resolution of these existing textures or set a new resolution. In addition, you can also specify how much memory the undo system will be allowed to use. Obviously, the more memory you allocate to the system, the more undos you'll get. So just set this to whatever you think is reasonable based on the amount of RAM you have in your system. Now, just click Begin Painting to begin. The painting tool will create a set of two textures. The first is the coat parameters texture. This is used for a few things. The red channel specifies the size that the fur card should be. The blue and green channels specify what range of textures in your fur card texture atlas should actually get used for specific fur cards. And the alpha channel lets you specify which areas should and should not have cards. The direction texture here is used to specify which direction these cards should be pointing. It is encoded in the same manner as a normal map, except instead of the vector representing a normal, it's obviously representing the direction the card points instead. We have a few options here to control the properties of our paintbrush. Brush size is obviously what it sounds like. It controls how large the brush is. Brush strength is going to control how intense the painting from the brush will be, whether it's very strong or very subtle. Brush hardness is going to control how much of a fade there is around the edge of the brushes. At 1, it's just a solid circle, and at 0, it's a very soft fade. We also have these normal masking options. This will allow you to prevent the brush from painting on surfaces opposite the one you're painting when you're on thin objects. As you can see, by default, front faces will be highlighted in blue and back faces getting painted will be highlighted in red. And you can see on the other side here, if I turn up the size, because these ears are so thin, both sides are getting painted. But if I decrease the normal masking threshold, now, as you can see, only the side actually facing us and the symmetrical mirror image of it over there are getting painted. We can also adjust the hardness of this cutoff. If we set softer, then there will be a little bit more of a fade as the normals get further away from the one we're painting. Whereas if we set harder, then there'll just be a harsh edge once the normal gets too far away from the center here that we're painting. There are a variety of modes we have for what we can actually paint. The first one, size, as you probably expect, is just the size of the cards. The range that we were able to paint is determined on the material here with the min and max size settings. When we paint 1, then we set it to be the max size, and when we paint 0, we set it to be the min size. You can also press B to quickly invert the value that you're currently painting, as well as pressing U to toggle the paintbrush on and off or switch to it after you open a different tool. Something else to note is that most painting modes will have this use range setting. When we activate this, instead of painting a fixed value, we paint a range. Any values outside of this range will be brought into this range, while values within the range will be unaffected. So for instance, if I set the range like this, you can see that cards bigger than the range get shrunk down a bit, whereas cards smaller than they get raised up, but these values in the middle that are already within the range are unaffected. The next option we have for painting is a mask. This will simply determine which areas do and do not have cards. A value of 1 will add cards, while a value of 0 will remove them. This also controls what type of lighting an area will get. The shader actually has different models for lighting for fur and non-fur areas, and this is driven by the mask as well. If you want more manual control over that, you can come down here and uncheck this box. This will then make it so that the fur or non-fur lighting type is determined by the red channel of this additional material parameters texture. This can be useful if you have areas that you want to have fur lighting without actually having fur cards on them. But if you don't want to specify this texture, you can just leave this box checked, and that will work for most people. Jumping ahead slightly, the next mode we're going to look at is the elevation mode. Put simply, this one just controls how raised up the fur cards will be. If it's set to a value of 1, the fur cards will be fully lifted up. And if it's set to a value of 0, they will be fully flattened to the model. Now, generally, you don't really want your fur cards to be 100% flat. As you can see here, you'll generally get issues where they start clipping into each other and such. Just generally doesn't look pretty good. So you usually want to have a value of at least 0.1 for the elevation. And the exact amount you'll need is actually going to depend essentially on how concave the curve of the area you're painting is, and also how long the cards are. So an area like this, as you can see, you get a bit of an issue where some of these cards are clipping into each other a little bit because there's such an inward curve here. So here, we might need to raise the elevation up to something like, 0.5 actually, a pretty extreme value in order to lift these cards out. And the longer the cards are, the greater the value you're going to have to use to lift them out. The easy way to do this is just to activate the use range setting, set the max to 1 and the min to whatever you want the minimum to be. And then any values below that will get raised up to the minimum you specified without values above that being affected. Moving on to something similar, we also have this orientation and elevation mode. Like the last one, this allows you to control elevation, but it also allows you to paint the orientation of the cards as well. Right now, this is set to have the min elevation be 0 and the max is 1. So our elevation is not actually being affected, but the cards are being rotated about their base to point in the direction of our paintbrush without affecting the elevation. We can, of course, instead of just using that full range, set the cards to some specific elevation, and we can simultaneously set that elevation while also controlling the orientation independently of each other. The last mode in this vein is the direction painting mode. This is similar to the last one, except here we can paint elevation and direction as one unified value rather than painting them both independently. What that means in practice is that if I paint against the grain of the fur here, as you can see, it lifts it up, while as the last tool would have just rotated it without actually affecting its elevation. This one has its own elevation settings, but rather than setting elevation directly, this controls what elevations that the painting will attempt to put the cards at as you move your brush across it. So if I set it to 0.4, for instance, as I paint across it, it will try to lift the cards up to an elevation of 0.4, but if I'm painting against it, it might raise them higher since I'm pushing them back in the opposite direction. This is generally going to be the most intuitive painting mode for painting card direction, whereas the other two are going to be more useful for making detailed adjustments after the fact. You may have noticed that both the direction and the orientation modes have this direction override checkbox here. if we click that, what this does is essentially makes it so that when we're painting direction, instead of the cards following the direction we move our mouse, they point towards a specific direction as we're painting. If you want to edit this direction, you can click this button here or just hit G to open this rotation gizmo. Set it to wherever you want. Hit G again to switch back to painting. As you can see, we can now paint another specific direction. This is very useful if you really want to fine-tune fluff that isn't necessarily supposed to be lying flat against the body. If you want even more specific control, you can also set your direction to a specific user-specified value right here. These last three painting modes all deal with controlling which textures the fur cards should be using. The fur cards use a texture atlas that contains multiple subtextures that it randomly chooses from when it's deciding which texture should go on an individual card. If for some reason you only want to use a certain subset of these textures, these painting modes can allow you to choose which subset that will be. For instance, say that you have, two different types of fur textures for different parts of the body that you want to look distinct from each other, or say you have fur and feather textures in the same atlas and you want to use them on the same model at the same time. This will allow you to choose which areas should be using which. In order to better visualize this effect, we're going to use this debug texture, which just has each of the textures in the atlas being a different solid color. We're going to select our avatar, scroll down to the card color texture down here, drag this in, and then set the blend mode to override. And now, as you can see, each of the cards is just set to the specific color value that was specified in this texture, making it very easy to see which cards are using which texture in the atlas. So now, the first painting mode we'll be looking at for the card textures is the texture count. This one simply determines how many textures in the atlas a given area are we choosing from. So for instance, if we set this to 2 and paint right here, we can see that the areas we painted are now only using the first 2 textures found in the atlas. The mode right above that, Atlas Texture Start Index, will allow you to choose which is the first texture that a given area should be looking at when it's determining which textures it should use. So for instance, instead of using the first and second texture, we want to use the second and third. We can set this to 1, and now it will skip the first texture in those areas. And as you can see, it's now using the second and third in those areas instead. When doing this selection, if it goes beyond the max number of textures in the atlas, it will wrap around. So for instance, if we set the offset to 3, now we're going to skip the first 3 textures, go for the 4th one, but then we're picking 2 textures out of that, so it will wrap around and end up using the 4th and the first one. As you can see right here, that's exactly what it does. Now, if you simply just want to use some specific range of textures, painting both the start index and the count independently can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around. So there's also this Texture Atlas Combine setting. This has 2 sliders, but instead of them being arranged like most other settings, the first one is the texture start index you want to use, which I'm going to set to 3 for this example. And the second one is the texture count value, which I will set to 1. So this will skip the first 3 textures, and then only use one texture, which should just give us the final texture as the only texture these cards will use. And now we can paint both these values simultaneously to get the exact set of textures we want. For instance, I could say I want to use the middle two textures. I just set this to 1 and this to 2. And now we have that right there. Or for instance, maybe I want to use the third, fourth, and first texture. I can set the start index to 2, the texture count to 3, and we can easily do that too. One other thing I'd like to note about this system is that it's perfectly acceptable to use fractional numbers as well for these texture indices. And what that will do is it will give a reduced chance of using certain textures. So for instance, if I set the start index to 0 and the count to 1.5, this will use the first and the second texture, but the second texture will only have a half chance of being selected. So as you can see, if I paint here, we're seeing about twice as many blue textures as we are pink ones. I can exaggerate this even more by using a lower fractional value. And you can see we are using both, but blue is much more represented. We can also have fractional start indices to reduce the possibility of the first texture in our list. So we set this to 0.5, for instance, and we count to 2. Now there will be a half chance of using this dark blue texture, a full chance of the second pink texture, another half chance of our light blue texture, creating a ratio where our 2 blues are according to the same probability as the 1 pink. Now, a couple other options you might want to be aware of for painting. First, you can check this box to enable or disable symmetry. This can be useful if you want to have asymmetrical fur detail on your model, or your model is not actually symmetrical. By checking this box right here, you can view where the plane of symmetry is, and you can adjust both the center and the axis along which symmetry is applied if your model is not symmetrical just on the left to right axis like most VRChat models typically will be. Additionally, we also have this texture space option. This will disable symmetry. However, it can be very useful for painting in areas of complex geometry like the mouth here. For instance, let's say that when you first create your model, there will be fur created everywhere, including in the mouth. And now we want to remove the fur from these teeth without affecting the sides of the mouth near it. Well, we can enable texture space rendering, and now our brush will be applied as though it was being drawn on the texture itself and not the model as it is in the world. So you can see if we select these teeth, the brush will only get applied to the teeth and then not to the jaw around it. And that allows us to easily remove the fur from these teeth without affecting anything else. Do be careful though, because if your brush is too big, it can end up affecting areas of the texture other than the one you intend to paint on, including areas that might physically not actually be very close to the spot you're painting. For instance, you can see on the jaw here, its UVs are very close to the UVs on the arm. So if I make the brush too big, I might accidentally end up painting there when I don't intend to. Once you're happy with how your fur looks, it's time to save these two textures you've created. You have two options for how to save them. The first is to save them as a Uni asset. Uni assets can only be used inside of Unity and also won't give you the benefit of texture compression. However, you will be able to save them with a high precision format, meaning that when it saves, it preserves more detail. So I recommend doing this when you're still actively iterating on your painting and you expect to be coming back to this and editing it, resaving it multiple times. That way you're not losing detail every time you save. Once you're done working on your textures, I recommend exporting them as PNGs using these second set of options here. Not only will this give you the benefit of texture compression, this will also allow these textures to be taken outside of Unity and used in other programs if you have some need to do that. Either way, once you're done saving, you should click Finish Painting and Close Project. This will update the textures on your material to the assets that you just saved to disk. While the tool is still open, the textures on your material will be temporary textures that the tool creates so that it can continuously update them as you paint. It's only once the tool is closed that it changes these textures to be the actual assets that you just saved. So be sure to always close the tool before you try to upload your avatar to VRChat. One other important detail is when using textures as opposed to Unity assets, you'll want to make sure that your import settings are set up correctly. The tool will be able to do this for you automatically if you export your PNGs into your Unity Assets folder. However, if you export somewhere else and drag those textures in, or you drag in some other existing textures, you'll need to set this up manually. The important settings are to set your texture type for your coat directions texture to normal map. And for your coat parameters texture, you can leave the texture type on default, but you'll want to uncheck this sRGB color texture setting. Leave it off. You'll also want to click Read Write for your parameters texture in order to let the optimization baking tool actually be able to read the values from this texture. Otherwise, it won't work. One other thing you can do is uncheck the Generate Bitmaps option. This isn't necessary, but bitmaps will not be used for these textures, so unchecking that saves a little bit of memory. Now, there's a couple other advanced features that might be useful to you. First, there is this remapping section in the tool. This can be used to essentially remap the values that are currently in one of these textures to a different range. The reasons you might use this, for instance, let's say you increase the max size of your fur cards, so now they are twice as big, but you want to keep the appearance the same and just have the option to paint bigger cards. Well, you can remap the size into a 0 to 0.5 range. As you can see, it will return these to the same size they were previously, but now we can paint a larger size overall. There's plenty of other uses for this. Say I want to essentially get rid of all the masking I've done, so I want to just add cards in everywhere. I could, for instance, just set the min and the max value both to 1, and now the mask just gets set to a flat value of 1 everywhere. Or say that I switch my card atlas from a atlas that has 4 textures in it to 8 textures. I could remap the texture count and start index to the 0 to 0.5 range to just have them still be the same 4 textures they're using now, just half the range. And then again, I have the ability to paint in those additional textures later. There is also this power curve exponent value. This will essentially, when you perform your remapping, just take the value that is being remapped and multiply it to the power of whatever value you set here. And that just allows you to, say, concentrate the values more towards the lower, the higher end as you do the remap. Also worth noting, you can set the min and max values for remapping outside the 0 to 1 range. The final texture will just get clamped into that 0 to 1 range after remapping is performed. So if I wanted to undo the change I made before, where I cut my size values in half by mapping to 0 to 0.5, I could map from 0 to 2 to double all those values, and now they are back to what they were before. A few other random settings that you might be curious about what they do. We have these submeshes enabled for painting. This is used if your renderer has multiple materials on it. This essentially selects which submeshes, i.e. which things get rendered by which material, will actually get painted. So for instance, if I enable submeshes 1 and 2, which are the eye and the eye lens, I could also be painting on this as well. Now, I wouldn't actually want to do that because these eye UVs overlap all the body UVs, so you get very incorrect results when you do that. So generally, you're only going to be wanting to paint on these submeshes that actually have your material on them, which is what the system does by default, so just leave it at default values 99% of the time. We also have this undo system tab, which will show you how much memory the undo system is currently using, and if it had to delete any strokes out of the undo chain in order to save memory. You also have the option to change the max amount of memory that the system is using if you find you are running out of strokes too quickly, or that your computer is slowing down because you allocated too much. You can just change it at any time right here. Also, you can change any of the keyboard shortcuts that this tool uses right here as well. And lastly, the final little bit that I haven't covered is we have these extra brush settings. Most of these are pretty obscure debug features that you don't really need to touch. We have the visualization color for forward and back faces. You can just change this to anything you like. For instance, if I want to change the back face to maybe green instead of pink, which is by default. You can also change the alpha of these. For instance, if I set to 0, you won't be able to see where your paint back faces at all. Or likewise, if I only want to show back faces, I could just set the front face value to 0, etc. Out of bounds UV handling is only really going to be used if your model has UVs that are outside the 0 to 1 range, like they're relying on tiling UVs. Most models aren't going to be doing that, but generally you're just going to want to set this to wrap mode, which will basically make it behave how you would expect with UVs outside the 0 to 1 range, just getting painted as though they were tiling. You can set it to clamp, in which case any areas that are outside the 0 to 1 UV range just won't get painted at all. Again, not something that most people are going to be using most of the time. And lastly, we have these little max roll distance between frame and max UV distance between frames. Essentially, what these are for are, say that you're doing some painting on the arm here, and then your mouse accidentally slips and you go over to the body. This essentially just says if the distance between the jump from the arm to the body was greater than this amount, don't continue the stroke across this entire thing and then just create a huge streak across the model as though I just painted super far. And this is the exact same thing, but in texture space for when you're in texture space painting mode. Again, probably not settings you're really going to have to mess with too much, but in case you're wondering what these are for, that's what it is. And that's all there is to know about the painting tool. I hope you find it intuitive to use and that you have fun making your own textures for your avatars. If you run into any issues or you need my help with something, feel free to reach out to me on my Discord, which you can find a link to in the README. Until then, have a good one.